Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through my favorite books that I picked up in the last quarter of the year. My reading definitely slowed down in the last quarter for a number of reasons. I tend to slow down a little bit anyway at the end of the year, just really enjoy time with family. And then also this year I was actually helping my mom out by watching her dog Dutton for a pretty large chunk of December. And then I also finished writing my second book, and that kind of consumed my life for a few months. The book Remnants of Dawn is longer than The Well of Ascension, currently, right now, by Brandon Sanderson, which is his longest work, if you're not counting the Stormlight Archive, to give you some perspective into the length. So it definitely took a lot of time. Hopefully, it'll be trimmed down once it's in my editor's hands and she can be like, hey, you don't need this, cut this also. But anyway, because my reading slowed down, I am actually combining my best of the year and my best new fantasy of the year. I typically split those so that the new fantasy can have its own little bit of spotlight, as can older fantasy and other genres. But I found I was pretty underwhelmed by a fair amount of the new fantasy that I picked up in the last quarter. A lot of it didn't really exceed my expectations, some of which it didn't even meet my expectations. So I only have one new fantasy that I really feel like I absolutely loved in the last quarter, and then the rest of these are other books that are not new fantasy. So anyway, jumping into it, the one new fantasy that's on the list would be The Fragile Threads of Power. I know that this series seems to be very hit or miss for a lot of people on BookTube, and when I say this series, I'm specifically referring to the original trilogy, The Shades of Magic. Fragile Threads of Power is a continuation. I thought it was going to be a little bit more separated from the original trilogy. It's really not. There's a 7-year difference, but a lot of our characters are still the main cast from the original trilogy. That was a pro for me. It would definitely be a con for a lot of other people that don't love those characters. I do think that Kel and Delilah Bard and just the characters in general are very distinct. So them not being liked by a fair amount of readers makes absolute sense to me. I just appreciate that they have as much personality as they do, and that they are as distinct as they are. I'll take that over a bland main character. I do think it's risky though, because for example, somebody like Wayne from Mistborn Era 2 is an example of a distinct character that's very hit or miss, and that's an example for me personally of one that was a miss. So while I understand why the characters don't always appeal to everybody, and also why the magic system, I'll extend it to that as well, doesn't work for everyone, because it does feel like it's ever expanding and we're building upon something that is somewhat established and mysterious, and then we're adding more to it constantly, and the amount we add to it is not the same as the amount of answers we're getting, so there seems to be like this imbalance constantly. I still love this world. I have such a good time with it. I had such a good time coming back to it. This new one definitely builds and it takes its time. I think the pacing is a little odd, where you're kind of revisiting the 7-year gap and what's happened in between. So you're trying to figure out everything that's transpired with our main cast of characters. Then you're getting introduced to new characters. You're getting introduced to new plot lines. And then you're kind of trying to segue into the new story and the new characters in the latter half, I'd say. Maybe even like the latter third of the last third of the book. So it has some things about it that are a little different. None of them really took away from the reading experience for me, though. I was so happy to be back in this world. I was so happy to be back with these characters. I liked seeing where they were now, and that's really tricky. With continuations, I can be very picky once the door has closed. I usually want it to stay closed. However, I think the third book in the original trilogy left so many things open, and I'd heard V.E. Schwab speak years and years ago when the third book had just come out, saying she always planned, one, for there to be more books in this world, so I always kind of knew that the third book wasn't actually the end, and randomly, not related to this series, but she always said she intended for the, I think it's called the Villain series, it starts with Vicious, she always intended, always, for that to be a trilogy. So knowing those two things, I think, really helped me, not both those things, the second thing doesn't have anything to do with this, but knowing that she always planned for there to be more, I think really helps me not feel like that door was officially closed. Also, no pun intended, since they have like doorways into other Londons. But anyway, I was so happy to be back. I do think that the writing feels a little different. I think her first series, especially the first book, feels so go, 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 go. And like this one, it's like she trusts the readers where she can take her time and will stay with her. And it does make for a buildup at the end that is really explosive, and a lot of the building blocks to that ending have been laid out for you so that it has more emotional stakes, has more literal stakes, and I just loved it. I love basically everything about it. I did do a read-along for the series, so I'll have, I should say, the original trilogy, and then we read this one, and we did some live shows and stuff, so I'll have that playlist linked if you would like to see spoiler thoughts, discussion, see other people's opinions. It was a lot of fun, though. The next few books I'm going to talk about, I'm not sure if this video will go up first or my end of the year wrap-up, but all the rest of these I did mention in my end of the year wrap-up, so depending on which video you end up watching, just know that you might be hearing about a fair amount of these again. But I'm going to start with a reread, another thing that I came back to, and that would be Rhythm of War. I did do a video talking about hyped books that I picked up in 2023 and whether they met the hype, and I talked about my experience with some of the secret projects as well as just rereading the Cosmere, and how Oathbringer for me was, it did not meet the hype, and that I was really pretty bummed about that. And when I say the hype, what I mean is reading through the first two books in Stormlight Archive again, Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, I loved them even more, and so I thought that same thing would apply to Oathbringer, and the opposite happened. And I could have then talked about Rhythm of War, because it also fits into a hyped book, and whether or not I found it met the hype. But I was like, let's just focus on Oathbringer and give it the time it deserves, and then we'll talk about Rhythm of War at a later date. And that would be now. This is now the later date. I was so happy to be back. And that's kind of the, I guess, key phrase. I was happy to be back. But that applies to Rhythm of War. And after that reading experience of Oathbringer, I was pretty nervous to pick this up again. I was like, what if this one's not as good as I thought it was also? And I loved it even more. It was also interesting because while it was the most recently read of the first 4 Stormlight Archive books, it's not that I forgot a lot of it, it's just that for some reason it hadn't settled in like the other ones did. The other ones felt more like I was going through familiar terrain, and this one felt like I was exploring things again. I think it's because so many people, at the very least, pick up the first 2 Stormlight Archive books, and then eventually, you know, maybe they'll get around to Oathbringer, maybe they'll get around to Rhythm of War, maybe they're waiting until Wind and Truth before they kind of have that final push, or they'll go back and reread the series and then get through it all. Whatever the case may be, I just find that there have been so many conversations, ones that I've listened to, that I've taken part in, that talk about this series, but Rhythm of War, because it's the newest of them, it doesn't feel like the events of this one have been talked about as much for as long, obviously, because Way of Kings has been out for years and years and years and years and years, where this one is newer, and so it's like, it's had this lasting, like, the story continues on, Way of Kings continues on, and I'm trying not to get into spoilers, but there are certain events and certain phrases that get pulled from those first few books that get talked about all the time, whereas this one, it's almost like we're still all worried about spoilers, if that makes sense, unless you go out seeking those things. That's a very long way to say that it just felt oddly newer to me coming back to it. It felt like it was something I didn't remember as vividly, even though I knew exactly the chapter, the moment early on where I was going to be hit with this like hard news. It wasn't a preview chapter. I just knew, I'm like, oh man, I wasn't ready. I had to put it down. I'm like, I can't read that part just yet because it's going to really, really destroy me. And just in general, the emotional hits hit just as hard, if not harder this time. I got just as emotional with a lot of things. And it also was so much fun reading this, having gone through a lot of theories for the series and what's going to happen in the 5th book, because, you know, some of them they feel reinforced reading this again with those in the back of my mind. Some of them I'm like, no, I don't really think so, but it just kind of made the reading experience even better. In general, Rhythm of War, loved it. I think it might be my favorite. It's still really hard for me to say I love it more than Way of Kings, because Way of Kings, there's just so many pros to that one as well, but this one I just think on its own, and rereading it, I might have had the best time. So anyway, I just love it. I love Rhythm of War. I can't wait, like a lot of us, for the 5th Stormlight book. Anyway, the next few, we have Green Rider, and this is one I read at the pretty much the end of 2023, and it was so cozy. It's kind of what I want out of fantasy that feels like classic fantasy. The series is ongoing, so it's been a long time. I believe there's 8 books now in the series, and I do plan to continue on with. I'm hoping to get caught up with the series this year, but I am interested to see how it changes as the series progresses, because this first one feels like classic fantasy, but what I want, because I think we all have different things that go through our head when we think classic fantasy. For some people, it's a specific book or series. Some people, it's certain tropes. Some people, it's maybe a negative thing, like you're gonna get annoying, poorly written female characters or something. Like, there's just certain things that we associate with classic fantasy. Not all classic fantasy. I'm just saying we have different things that come to mind. And I don't have this extensive amount of reading experience with classic fantasy. I have some, but not nearly as much as a lot of other people. So for me, I think I have kind of like a clean slate when I pick up a classic fantasy. What I want out of them is to feel transported, to have this almost like cozy feeling where you just are like, I'm taken to this land. It feels like pure escapism. It's not that I dislike the fantasy that feels very related to our own world and our own experiences, but it's almost like I want to feel as though I'm being told a story and I'm like curled up by the fire and there's this master storyteller telling me about this grand adventure that somebody went on. Like, that's kind of what I want when I pick up classic fantasy or classic feeling fantasy, and that's exactly what I got from Green Rider. I really liked our main character a lot. I thought she was fantastic, and the setup is that on her way to get to where she's going, she comes across a man and in his dying breath asks her to please deliver this message that he was trying to deliver. It matters for the safety of the entire realm, kind of thing. And she's like, I mean, okay, I can deliver this, I guess. And she feels like she has to. And then as she starts to take this task upon herself and embark on this little quest that turns into a very big quest, she finds she is essentially immediately in danger. And she encounters different people on this quest. Sometimes she's in a lot of danger, and sometimes she is among very, very sweet, wholesome people who are helping her, and they feel like maybe they're a little magical. And so there's a lot to this. It kind of has that ultimate good, ultimate evil feel where you're like, ultimate good seems kind of ambiguous and mysterious, and you don't know if it even really is a thing. But then there's the kind of bad guy that's the bad of the bad, and the Dark Lord type of character, and they're very much present, and they want to take power for themselves, and they want to do a lot of bad things, and that's what we're trying to avoid. And it has a lot of those kind of stereotypical things about fantasy, but it was done exactly how I was hoping. Very cozy, very, like I said before, kind of escapism, transporting you to this fantasy land, and I really, really liked it. But what I was talking about as far as being curious to see how it progresses is because the series is still being written, I'm very intrigued as to if that feeling is going to persist or if it's going to start to get a little bit more character focused, because I'd say a lot of modern fantasy feels more character focused or thematically focused, and I'm curious if that's going to be almost a tonal shift throughout the series. I'm not opposed to that. It just could make for a really interesting reading experience. I know that the newest one is chunky. This one is not very big. That newest one is big. So I'm really curious, just in general. Curious is the word for that series, apparently. I have words and phrases of the day. I'm so happy to be back, and I'm curious. So anyway, moving on. Nonfiction, Cobalt Red. I do find that this book is very emotionally difficult to get through, but I think it's a very necessary book to pick up. I think pretty much everybody should pick this up. And if you don't read this, there are a lot of documentaries that go through this topic, and I'm sure you can find articles that talk about it as well. The idea being the mining in the Congo by the Congolese is so incredibly brutal and horrific and inhumane, but it is currently what is fueling in a lot of ways, our economy and our technology. Cobalt's used in a variety of different things. It's used, the main things that we think of are our phones and in electric cars. As a result of the demand that is placed on those sorts of products, these people, it does not feel like there's hope for them. And there's going to be big changes needed if they are going to ever be treated fairly. I feel like fairly is just, it's so far from where they're currently treated. I mean, they really are treated like slaves. They have horrible lives, and you you read through what they have to experience and the way in which everybody turns a blind eye and nobody takes accountability for what's happening. It's obviously nonfiction if that's not clear. The full title, Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives. Very good. I really, really think everybody should pick this up. I know it's not easy. If you're not I was about to say if you're not a big reader. If you're here, you're probably, sorry, I almost dropped some books. I was about to say, if you're not a big reader, it would make sense why you might want to watch those other things. Most of you are probably big readers. However, I'll go on to say that I know not everybody is big in reading nonfiction. Maybe you internalize things, you remember things better when it comes to nonfiction if you're hearing somebody talk through it like in a documentary. Whatever the case may be, it's a topic I think we all could make sure that we know about and that we try to use that information to make more informed purchases or to avoid purchasing things that we really don't need. Anyway, I know I recorded my end of the year wrap up and I said the same thing where I'm not trying to be preachy or tell anybody what to do or make anybody feel really awful for the fact that there is just an inherent unfairness to, if you are watching this video, chances are your life is very different from a person in the Congo who is subjected to the terrors that they are subjected to. The fear of being in a mine when it collapses and being buried alive and not having food, not being able to provide for your family, or your child is harmed and you don't have the money for them to get the surgeries that they need. You can't send them to school because there's fees at the schools, and there's just so much, just nonstop terrible thing. There's one terrible thing after the next. It's constant that they have to experience. And anyway, when I'm saying I'm not trying to make people feel bad, it's just that it's not fair. I do think there is a healthy level of feeling bad that a lot of us experience. I think that's rooted in empathy. But I also, I'm not trying I'm not trying to ruin anybody's day, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, bottom line, I think everybody should read that book. I think it's fantastic. Probably one of the best nonfiction books I've picked up, and very difficult subject matter, but very important. Switching gears, last thing I'll say is I'm repeating something I had on a previous best of list, but I read a lot more of it, so I'm just kind of grouping it together, and that would be Murderbot. While this is one of the best of the year, I would not say I have loved Murderbot on the same level as Rhythm of War and even Fragile Threads of Power. I love that there's so many themes to do with mental health, anxiety, depression, fitting into a society when you really don't feel like you belong. And I think it's all done in a way that it's capturing the mundane nature of day-to-day life and interactions, which makes it very entertaining. And I just think that there's so many of us that can relate to some of the very little things in this, but then also the bigger concepts and those bigger themes. So I see why it's so well loved. I did enjoy it. I had such a good time. I would not say this is going to probably land in my favorite series of all time necessarily, but it's pretty hard to break into that list. You know, I only have so many and it's really hard to get up there, but I really, really have enjoyed this series so much, and it's just such a nice palate cleanser between the epic fantasy or the dense fantasy or even the more traditional sword and sorcery classic type fantasy to read a sci-fi that's pretty futuristic, but then is somehow capturing the very essence of what it is to be a person in our own time, in our own world. The fact that it can do that is very fun, and like I said, it's refreshing, and it's just nice to pick up, which is not what you would think when you're like, Murderbot, I'm sorry. The narrator is a man, and so I always associate Murderbot with a man, and that's not accurate, so apologies. But anyway, they are, I just find that it's interesting when you hear like, oh, they are this machine capable of mass killing, basically, and you're like, oh, but they like get annoyed with people the same way I do. It's not, you wouldn't think like, oh, wholesome and sweet and fun when you hear how intense. But I feel like that's part of it, is the perception, and that you could even be kind of meta with this. Like, there's the perception that we have, and you can apply that to our perception of people and society. And anyway, you can think you have a certain view of something and it can be completely different and completely wrong, and your feelings towards somebody or the way in which you see them is maybe not what's going on internally, and it's just kind of a nice reminder. Anyway, I really have enjoyed this quite a bit, so I did feel like, having read so much more of it, it deserved to get to be on another best of list. But that's it for my best of the year, October through December. I think I would like to do a recap of all of my favorites and either do some kind of tier ranking or narrow it down to specific, I don't know, top 5 or something. Do that for what would be basically like today's video. I only included one new fantasy, but the regular backlist fantasy or other genres, and do a video for that, and then do one talking about the new fantasy that I've loved in 2023. We'll see. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to go about that yet, but regardless, let me know in the last chunk of 2023 what were your favorite things that you picked up. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.